Henry Waller had buried 3 families in 11 Kansas winters, and he could read the mathematics of survival, the way other men read the Bible not for comfort, but because the numbers never lied. He stood at the edge of what had been the Hendrick property on a Tuesday morning in August of 1886, and he did what he always did. When the facts were plain, he delivered them without decoration. 4 limestone walls, roofless and blackened at the crown, where the fire had burned hottest 2 years prior. Packed earth floor worn smooth by 2 seasons of rain and wind. No door, no glass in the window frames. Nothing overhead but the merciless Kansas sky pressing down like a flat iron on everything beneath it. A woman stood in the center of it all. 2 children picked through the rubble near the eastern wall. The woman was not crying, which he noted, and she was not panicking, which surprised him more than the crying would have. But neither of those things changed what the walls told him, and what they told him was simple arithmetic. This family had purchased a grave with a deed attached. Eleanor Marsh had traveled 340 miles from the moment her husband drew his last breath in a Missouri churchyard to the moment she set $5 silver on the counter of the Russell County Land Office. That distance had cost her everything she owned, except the coins themselves, and she did not think of it as loss so much as the clearing of weight before a long climb. Robert Marsh had understood farming the way she understood people, with an ease that looked like instinct, but was actually the accumulated result of paying close attention for a very long time. He had died of cholera on the 23rd of April, still lucid enough in the final days to be frightened for what he was leaving behind, and she had held his hand through all of it and told him what she believed, that she would find a way. She had not known what the way would look like. She had only known the shape of the alternative. The alternative was Robert's family in Philadelphia, who had a house with enough rooms and a standing offer she could feel the conditions attached to every time they mentioned it. She would be taken care of. Her children would be raised properly. She would, in every way that could be measured from the outside, be fine. And she would spend the remainder of her life in rooms that belonged to other people, making decisions that required other people's approval, raising children who would grow up understanding that their mother had needed to be rescued. Eleanor had spent 3 days considering this, which was longer than she needed, and then she had packed what she could carry and started moving. She sold the oxen in Missouri to pay for the wagon's repairs after the axle broke outside Salina, then sold the wagon itself to buy train passage west. By the time she walked into the Russell Land Office, she had $5 silver, 2 children, a carpet bag containing a spare dress, a Bible, and a photograph of a man who had never seen Kansas. She had spent approximately 90 minutes the evening before her visit walking the perimeter of every available property she could reach before dark, and she had made her decision in the same way she made all decisions that mattered, by identifying the one available option that contained a structural advantage, invisible to everyone who had not spent the preceding 3 weeks thinking about exactly this problem. The land office clerk had the practiced efficiency of a man who had processed enough grief to have developed a working relationship with it, and he assessed Eleanor the way professionals in his position assessed everyone, quickly, comprehensively, and without much generosity. Faded calico dress, mended elbows, 2 children positioned behind her with the quiet watchfulness of children who had learned not to ask questions in rooms where adults were conducting important business. The boy was perhaps 8, his hand resting on his younger sister's shoulder with the unconscious protectiveness of someone who has appointed himself to a responsibility no one formally assigned. The girl was 5, and she held a small bundle against her chest and surveyed the room with eyes that were darker and steadier than 5-year-old eyes typically managed. Another widow filing on a claim, the clerk assumed. They came through regularly that season, the drought having emptied half the county's filed claims, and they all had the same combination of determination and careful blankness that people wear when they are afraid that showing the full extent of what they need will somehow reduce what they are offered. Eleanor set 5 coins on the counter and asked for the Hendrick ruin. The clerk blinked. His entire categorization of her rearranged itself. The Hendrick place was not a property anyone filed on. It was a chimney fire 2 years gone, or possibly something more deliberate, depending on which version of the story was making its rounds that week. And what remained was 4 walls of fence-post limestone standing in the middle of an 8-acre parcel with nothing inside them but packed earth and the accumulated debris of 2 years of weather. No roof, no door, no window glass. Not fit for habitation, he told her. Is it for sale? Her hand stayed flat on the $5. He told her yes, technically. He told her $5 was what she had. He told her winter out here was not like winter back east, that the cold killed that. She understood this, he assumed. She kept her hand on the coins and asked if $5 was sufficient. The clerk looked at the boy with his hand on his sister's shoulder, looked at the girl with the bundle, looked at the $5 and reached for the deed. He was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had learned that some decisions made themselves regardless of his input, and that attempting to redirect them required more confidence in his own judgment than the situation warranted. Henry Waller came the morning after Eleanor signed the deed because in a town the size of Russell, information traveled faster than horses. He walked over from his homestead 300 yards north without bringing anything with him, which Eleanor would later understand was deliberate. He was not there to help and did not want the gesture of carrying something to imply otherwise. He was there because he had seen 3 families die in preparation failures, and he was constitutionally unable to watch a 4th commence without stating clearly what he knew. He had survived 11 Kansas winters. He had built his homestead from raw sod and stubbornness, and the knowledge that you prepared for the worst that had ever happened, and then prepared for something worse than that. He had watched the Brennan family freeze in the winter of 1881 because the storm lasted 5 days longer than anyone had predicted, and they had rationed themselves into nothing, trying to outlast what they could not outlast. He had carried Carl Brennan's wife out of that homestead himself, and the weight of her was not what he remembered so much as the particular quality of the silence in that building, the way a space sounds when everything that had made it warm is gone. His wife Martha had watched Eleanor through the window on the first morning and said what she always said when she saw someone struggling in a way that Henry had decided was inevitable. You should go help her. Henry had looked at the ruin 300 yards away with its missing roof and its widow standing inside it with 2 small children, and had done the calculation that 11 winters had built into him. She'll die either way, he had told Martha. The math doesn't leave room for it. Martha had not argued, which was her version of not agreeing, and the distinction mattered to her even when it changed nothing. He stood at the edge of the ruin the next morning and delivered what he knew. No timber within 15 miles for fuel, all cut years back, no cattle for chips, no land for hay. One woman with no winter preparation knowledge, no tools beyond what she had carried in a single bag, and 8 weeks until first frost 10, until the hard cold that made first frost seem like an inconvenience. He was precise about the numbers. He named specific temperatures. He described what had happened to the children he had found in homes where the preparation had fallen short, and he described it without flinching, because the flinching would have been for his comfort rather than her information. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who believed that clarity was a form of respect. Eleanor listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. She did not display any of the visible distress that his experience told him this news typically produced, and the absence of that distress was the first thing that deviated from his expectation of how this conversation would go. When he finished, she asked one question. What has killed the families you've watched die out here? He answered because it was a genuine question from someone who was listening, and because he respected the economy of it. Roofs that failed, fuel that ran out, food stores that didn't last the distance. Not limestone walls, Eleanor said. Henry Waller left. He walked back toward his homestead with the same measured stride he had arrived with, and if the conversation had moved into territory he was not prepared for, his face did not confirm this. He went back to his work, which was the work of a man who believed he had stated the situation accurately and could not be held responsible for what happened to people who received accurate information and proceeded anyway. He would return. He knew this already. He was the kind of man who could not stop coming back to a situation he considered serious, even a situation he had decided was already resolved in the wrong direction. The idea came to Eleanor 3 days later on the second water run of the afternoon, and it came from the wall itself. She had been carrying water from the town well to the ruin, twice daily, a quarter mile each direction, the bucket heavy enough to make the tops of her shoulders burn with a consistent, low-grade pain that she had begun to think of as simply the sensation of the work rather than a warning about it. She stopped at the eastern wall to rest, set the bucket down, leaned back against the limestone and felt it cool. Not slightly cool. Cool in the way that the air at the bottom of a well is cool, carrying a temperature that belonged to a different time of day stored there since the night before, and declining to release itself to the August afternoon, pressing against the other side of the stone. She pressed both palms flat. Her grandmother had kept a root cellar below the kitchen of her house in Philadelphia, accessed by a wooden door in the kitchen floor that opened onto steep stone steps. The cellar stayed cool through the hottest weeks of summer, not by generating cold, but by retaining it. The earth 6 feet thick on all sides, absorbing the seasonal extremes and averaging them out into something survivable for the vegetables and salted meat stored there. It stayed warm enough in winter to keep the potatoes from freezing, not because of any fire, but because the earth itself, that depth of earth, held heat the same way it held cold slowly and with the enormous patience of mass. Eleanor stood with both hands against the limestone in the August heat and understood that she was touching a root cellar that someone had already built for her, 4 walls of it, 2 feet thick on every side. The missing piece was the ceiling, not a wooden roof. Wood was thin, permeable, a membrane that let everything through in both directions. But sod, the same dense root-thick prairie that settlers cut for their house walls, had exactly the thermal mass she needed. Laid horizontal on timber beams, sealed with loose soil in the gaps, it would behave exactly the way the walls behaved, absorbing heat from a fire lit inside, holding it, releasing it slowly through the night after the fire dimmed. The walls would work with it, not against it. They had already been storing cold for 2 summers, which meant they already knew how to store the opposite. She looked at the ruin of the Hendrick barn visible through the open window frame to her right. The barn walls still stood, tangled in the collapsed upper portion she had noticed on her first day here, but not yet thought about clearly, were timbers charred at the ends. Yes, but the char was a surface condition. She had seen Robert split wood enough times to know that fire traveled inward slowly through dense hardwood, burning the outside while the core stayed sound. 1 ridgepole, 15 rafters. She did not know if the weight calculations would resolve correctly. She did not know if the sod would seal at the peak. She did not know if any of this was more than the desperate improvisation of a woman with no other options, which it might have been, which it was, but it was also the only construction method available to her that started from what already existed, rather than requiring what she did not have. Eleanor picked up the water bucket, finished the second trip of the afternoon, and started planning the ramp she would need to get the ridgepole up the walls. Agnes Cole was not looking for anyone when she found Eleanor dragging a charred timber 3 days later, just as she was not looking for trouble when she generally found it. Both arrived as consequences of paying attention, which Agnes had never been able to stop doing. She was 43, lean and weathered in the particular way that Kansas made people lean, reshaped by years of practical necessity into a version of herself that retained her original opinions but had abandoned anything ornamental. Her husband Thomas had been a drunk, in the way that some men are drunks, as a primary occupation, with secondary activities arranged around it, and he had died 2 years prior in a manner that Agnes had told people was consumption. And that was more accurately the predictable result of replacing most of one's diet with grain alcohol for an extended period. She had been managing the coal quarter section alone, since which had taught her several things she had not previously known about herself, chief among them, that she was more capable than she had suspected, and considerably less patient with inefficiency than social conventions generally allowed her to admit. She watched Eleanor move the beam another 10 inches with both hands on the charred wood, both arms shaking with the sustained effort of it, and she climbed down from her wagon and asked what she was building. Eleanor told her in the fewest words necessary: the plan, the ruin, the sod roof on timber beams, the thermal logic of limestone walls combined with the insulating mass of prairie earth. Agnes nudged the end of the beam with her boot, testing it, looking at where the char gave way to soundwood underneath. She was silent for a moment that contained actual thought rather than performance. Sod roof weighs 3 tons, she said. Maybe 4 when it's wet after a thaw. The walls are 2 feet thick. They'll carry it. You sure about that? Eleanor was not sure about that in the way that certainty requires evidence, and she said so. Agnes looked at the 4 walls visible across the open ground, then at Eleanor's shaking arms, then back at the timber. She turned to go, then stopped. She told Eleanor about Ruth Becker 2 miles east, the plow horse, the possible trade. She delivered this information with the flat efficiency of someone who considers information a resource to be allocated where it will do the most work, not a kindness to be performed. Then she climbed back into her wagon and continued down the road without waiting for a thank you she would not have known what to do with anyway. Eleanor bent down and gripped the timber. Ruth Becker listened to the full proposal without interrupting, which was her habit, and also the primary reason her assessments were reliable. She was 71 years old, had crossed half a continent, and buried everyone she had started the crossing with, and had arrived at the particular clarity of a person who no longer has anything to prove to anyone. She stood and walked to the barn and showed Eleanor the gray gelding without ceremony. 3 days of Eleanor's labor for 3 days of use of the horse terms stated once not negotiated. Before Eleanor left, Ruth reached into her apron pocket and produced a clean strip of cloth and held it out. Eleanor's hands were cracked at 3 knuckles, bleeding where the bark of the timber had taken the skin. Good hands build good shelters. Ruth kept her arm extended. Wrap them before you go. Eleanor wrapped them. She walked back to the ruin with the cloth on her fingers and the understanding that she had just made an ally of the most competent woman in the county, though neither of them would have used that word for several months yet. Clarence Dodd arrived on the 6th day of Eleanor's sod cutting, traveling from Topeka, in the particular style of a man who has decided that appearing successful is an investment rather than an expense. His suit was clean despite the August heat. His boots were polished in a way that made the dust coating them by the time he reached Eleanor's work site look almost deliberate, as if the boots were performing field conditions rather than actually experiencing them. He was a land speculator of 15 years' experience and 23 successfully predicted failures, and he approached Eleanor with the smooth certainty of a man who has been right so many times that he has mistaken track record for prophecy. He offered $8. Cash today, he told her. 3 more than she had paid. It's not for sale. He deployed the tools of his trade in sequence: the knowing smile, the gesture toward the half-built roof with its ridge pole and 8 angled rafters, the friendly version of the forecast she had already heard from Waller. It wasn't going to work. The wood wouldn't hold the weight. Every man in Russell County understood this. He was offering her a way out, a chance to take her children somewhere. The cold wouldn't kill them, and he phrased it with the particular warmth of a man who has long practice making the act of purchasing someone else's failure feel like a form of generosity. Eleanor stopped the horse. She turned to face him and asked the question that had been forming since the moment she registered what his offer actually implied. If I'm going to die and the roof won't work, why offer $8? Why not wait and buy from the county for 3? The smile held by habit for 2 seconds before his eyes recalibrated. He told her the limestone walls had value regardless of what happened to the building. Someone would want them eventually. You're not buying limestone, Eleanor said. You're buying yourself out of a bet you're not certain you'll win. Dodd moved closer. He told her the only difference between his offer today and the county tax sale in April was that she would be dead and he would pay less. He was not wrong about this. He was right about almost everything he said in the way that a man who is always right about property values is right. What he was wrong about was the thing he was actually evaluating, which was not the property, but the person who owned it. "Then I suppose you can wait," Eleanor said, and turned back to her horse. Dodge stood in the field for a long moment. The polished boots had achieved a significant quantity of Kansas dust. The clean suit had developed a slight tightness across the shoulders from the heat. He left the way men leave when they have not lost so much as encountered terrain they were not equipped for, and Eleanor kept the plow moving through another long strip of sod without watching him go. The ridgepole took 2 full days, and the combined effort of Eleanor, both her children and Ruth Becker's borrowed horse. She built ramps from rubble-broken limestone stacked carefully against each end wall, each piece tested before the next. She tied ropes to the trunk's ends, looped them over the wall tops, and pulled. The horse pulled. Caleb pulled until the tendons in his small forearms stood out like cables. Lily pulled behind her brother with both hands wrapped around the rope, adding what she weighed to the effort. The trunk slipped twice, nearly taking Eleanor's foot the first time, and they started over twice, and on the afternoon of the second day, the ridgepole rolled up the final angle of the ramp and tipped and settled across the full 16 feet of the ruin's width, with the solid finality of something that had found its place. Caleb sat down in the rubble and looked at his hands. "It's up." Not celebration, not relief, just the flat confirmation of a fact that had cost enough to deserve its own moment. The rafters went faster. 15 cottonwood poles from the same creek bed, notched to rest against the ridge pole, laid across the walls at measured intervals. Each one a day's work of cutting, dragging, lifting, securing. Each one another unit of what might eventually be a ceiling, accumulating across September, the way the cold was accumulating in the nights. By the 14th of September, Eleanor had placed half the sod. She woke before dawn to the silence that follows an overnight freeze, dressed quickly, and stepped outside into air that carried 28 degrees in its teeth. Frost on every surface. On the partial roof, the unplaced half still open to the sky, the frost caught the first gray light and returned it transformed. Henry Waller had predicted first frost in 16 days. It had come 16 days early. Eleanor stood in the pre-dawn cold and looked at her half-finished roof and completed the calculation quickly because there was no benefit to completing it slowly. At her current pace, she needed 14 more days to finish the remaining sod. She had, starting from this morning, none to spare. She went back inside, woke both children, told them what the morning required. Caleb received this without comment and sat up. Lily was already sitting. They ate cold cornmeal and went to work before the frost had finished burning off the grass. Ruth Becker arrived 3 days later at 7 in the morning without announcement or preamble, bent down at the pile of unplaced sod blocks beside the ruin's ladder, lifted one onto her shoulder with a sound her spine made audibly, and carried it to the ladder's base. Eleanor paused on the ladder above her and looked down. "You want to argue," Ruth said, "or you want to finish this roof 9 hours. 42 blocks placed, 28 remaining." When the light failed, Ruth set down the last block she had been carrying and straightened slowly and looked at what they had built together that day, the roof now more covered than not, the placed sod already beginning to dry to a darker color at the edges. She did not say it was good. She did not say well done. She said tomorrow and walked back toward her property in the last of the light, and Eleanor watched her go and felt a particular quality of gratitude that is too large and too complicated to name, but that settles into the chest and stays. That night, Eleanor sat against the eastern wall with both children asleep and pressed one bandaged palm against the limestone. Warm. Not the warmth of sunshine, it was evening now, but the warmth of the fire she had managed in the cleared rubble, absorbed into 2 feet of stone and held there and slowly, steadily returned to the space inside the walls. The principle was working. She could feel it working under her hand, the wall giving back what the fire had given it, the same transfer she had been counting on since August. Above her, the half-finished roof showed the line between placed and unplaced clearly in the moonlight on one side. The dark mass of earth and grass, roots solid insulating. On the other, the open Kansas sky and the stars burning cold in the air above. The line between them was exactly where everything stood. 28 blocks from a closed roof. 2 mornings left to place them. She heard Caleb's breathing change slightly in the way that meant he was not quite asleep. The beams haven't cracked, he said. No. With all those blocks. No. A pause. The fire had settled to embers. Outside, the night was the kind of cold that was not yet dangerous, but was practicing. I don't think it's going to fall, Caleb said. Eleanor leaned her head back against the limestone and looked up at the line where earth met sky. Tomorrow Ruth Becker would come back. 28 blocks would become 27, then 26, then fewer. The frost would return tonight and the night after. Henry Waller's prediction about first frost had been wrong by 16 days, and the cold that arrived 2 weeks ahead of his calculations was not interested in the error. It was coming at the speed it had always come, unchanged by any estimate, and 2 days from now, if the pace held, if nothing went wrong, if 28 blocks became zero without incident, the roof would be finished. 2 days left to place it, 1 morning already spent. The line between placed and unplaced shifted in the moonlight as a cloud moved somewhere above it, and Eleanor watched the shadow cross the open section of sky above her and kept her palm flat against the warm stone, and did not finish the thought that wanted to be finished, because finishing it required knowing the answer to the question she had been refusing since August, not whether the roof would hold, but whether she would have enough time to close it before the closing was no longer possible. She did not know. The wall was warm under her hand. That would have to be enough for tonight. The roof closed on the 7th of October, and Eleanor stood in the center of the shelter for a long time afterward without moving. 3 tons of Kansas prairie pressed down on charred cottonwood beams above her head. The sod was packed tight, grass side down, loose soil filling the gaps between blocks, the whole surface darkening as it dried and settled into itself. She had expected to feel relief. What she felt instead was the particular alertness of someone standing beneath a large thing held up by their own calculations, waiting to discover whether the calculations were right. Nothing moved, nothing cracked. The walls absorbed the weight the same way they had absorbed everything else she had asked of them, without complaint, without drama, simply by being what they were. Caleb stood beside her, looking up at the earthen ceiling. Lily stood on his other side, her neck tilted back, studying the underside of the sod, with the focused attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. Is it done? Caleb finally asked, his voice carrying the flatness of someone who has been waiting to ask something for a long time and has finally decided the waiting is finished. Eleanor put her hand on his shoulder. The roof was done. The shelter was not finished, a roof was not a home, and a home was not survival. And survival in Kansas, November was a system of interlocking requirements that failed completely if any single part of it failed. She still needed a stove. She still needed fuel enough to last until April. She still needed food stores that could carry 3 people through 5 months of days when leaving the shelter might not be possible. The roof was one wall of a structure that required 4, and she had built it in 8 weeks starting from nothing, and the remaining 3 walls would have to be built faster. Henry Waller came that evening without being invited, which was consistent with his pattern. He walked a slow circle around the outside of the shelter, examining the places where the sod met the limestone walls, looking for gaps where the weather could find purchase, studying the pitch of the roof surface with the eye of a man assessing whether water would sheet off or pool. Eleanor watched from the doorway, the makeshift door of salvaged planks, functional but not elegant, fitted to the opening she had cut in the south wall. He had not offered to help build it. She had not asked. He completed the circuit and stood facing her with the particular expression he wore when he was revising something he had already decided. The roof might hold, he said. The problem was no longer the roof. Without a stove, without fuel stockpiled, without food stores that could last to April, shelter was just a slightly more comfortable place to die. He was not wrong about this. She told him as she was working on it, and something in his face shifted, a small recalibration that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it, close enough that she could see the difference from where she stood. There was a box stove behind the Hendrick barn, he told her then. He had looked at it the previous spring and decided it wasn't worth the labor of salvaging. Cracked firebox, the crack running along the bottom of the combustion chamber where the heat was hottest. Iron cement would seal it $2 a can at the general store. He had checked. He turned to go, then stopped, and said the thing she understood was the real reason he had come. He still thought she would die. But she would die trying, which he had not expected, and that distinction apparently was enough to make the stove worth mentioning. Eleanor walked to the Hendrick barn after dark with the lantern Ruth Becker had lent her. The stove was buried under collapsed roof beams, heavy with rust, but the crack Waller had described was visible once she cleared the debris, a line along the firebox floor, the length of her hand running through the thickest iron. Without repair, any fire would push heat and smoke directly into the room through that gap, which was one version of disaster. With repair, iron cement packed into the crack and cured slowly, it would seal hard enough to withstand sustained burning. Iron cement cost $2, and she had nothing that converted to $2 without losing something she needed worse. She walked 2 miles east the next morning to Ruth Becker's property and explained the situation in the direct manner she had learned Ruth responded to. Ruth listened without speaking, then stood and led Eleanor to the barn and moved a barrel of rusted nails aside and produced 2 cans of iron cement from behind it, labels faded but legible. Eleanor told her she could not take them without paying for them. Ruth pressed both cans into Eleanor's hands and told her not to take them, then trade for them. She pointed to the barn roof with its visible sag in the northwest corner. Spring Eleanor would come patch it. They were even. Eleanor looked at the cans. She asked what happened if she didn't survive until spring, and Ruth's weathered face arranged itself into something that might have been a smile on a face less economical with its expressions. Then she would patch it herself and curse the ghost, Ruth told her. She turned back toward her porch without ceremony, leaving Eleanor standing in the barn doorway, holding 2 cans of iron cement, and the understanding that she had just been given something that required her to survive in order to repay it, which was a form of obligation she had not anticipated, and which she found on reflection considerably more motivating than a gift would have been. She installed the stove on the 19th of October, which meant 2 weeks of carrying it piece by piece from the Hendrick barn to the shelter, the firebox alone weighing 60 pounds, the body of it requiring 2 trips with the components disassembled. She mixed the iron cement to the consistency described on the label, packed it into the crack, worked it into the gap with her finger until the seal was uniform, and left it to cure for 48 hours because the label specified 48 hours, and she was not interested in discovering what happened if she abbreviated the instruction. She cut a hole through the sod roof for the stovepipe using a tool she improvised from a broken hay fork, sealed the gap around the pipe with the additional saw packed tight against the metal. On the evening of the 19th, she lit the first fire. Small not because she was rationing yet, but because she wanted to see what the stove and the walls did together before she asked them to do it under pressure. Eleanor and both children sat on the packed earth floor and watched the flames take hold behind the cracked mica window of the stove door. The heat came outward with a directness that the open rubble fires of the previous weeks had never managed, focused and radiating. And within 20 minutes, Eleanor could feel the air in the shelter changing, not just warming, but thickening slightly, the way the air in a closed space thickens when it's been breathed and warmed by living things. She pressed her palm against the limestone. It was absorbing. She could feel the warmth moving into the stone, the slow transfer of heat from the combustion chamber through the air and into the mass of the walls, the same process she had been theorizing about since August now happening under her hand. "The wall is warm." Caleb set his palm flat against the stone beside hers, the same words but carrying something new. Not the wondering of someone testing a theory, but the confirmation of someone who has been watching their mother build this thing for 2 months and is now watching it work. Lily pressed her ear against the stone, as if she expected to hear something inside it. She straightened up and announced with the authority of 5 years and complete conviction, "It sounds like it's thinking." By the 1st of November, Eleanor had accumulated what she could. 3/4 of a cord of cottonwood dragged from the creek bed and split with a borrowed axe against the eastern wall. 2 wagon loads of dried cow chips from the prairie gathered before the first hard snow, stacked under a canvas tarp behind the shelter. 40 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of dried beans, a barrel of salt pork, a sack of potatoes, she estimated would last until mid-January on careful rationing. She had written all of it down on the back of the land deeds envelope in columns with weeks marked along one axis and estimated consumption along the other. The arithmetic was straightforward and the conclusion was specific. She was short by 6 weeks. February and March remained uncovered. Waller came on the 3rd of November with his breath clouding white in the morning air and stood beside her fuel pile counting it. He worked through the calculation that she had already done and arrived at the same answer. 3 months of heat maybe if she was careful. Nothing in February. He said the cow chips would help, might extend things by another 3 or 4 weeks, but April was still a long way from where the numbers resolved. He asked what she was planning to do about the gap. Eleanor looked at her fuel pile, then at the shelter with its sod roof and the thin line of smoke rising from the stovepipe into the gray November sky. She told him she planned to survive the months she had covered and address the remaining months when she reached them. Waller shook his head. That was not a plan, he told her. That was a prayer. She told him she intended to pray then, and something crossed his face, not amusement. He was not a man who came easily to amusement, but something in the vicinity of it, reluctant and brief. He walked away without responding, which she was beginning to understand was not dismissal, but the response of a man whose certainties were being adjusted in increments he had not budgeted for. The first hard snow came on the 18th of November, 6 inches overnight, that drifted to 2 feet against the shelter's north wall by morning. Eleanor woke to it before dawn, added wood to the stove, and took the thermometer Waller had delivered the previous week, his one explicit concession to the possibility that she might last long enough for it to be useful outside to read it. 11 degrees above zero. Inside the shelter, the thermometer read 42. 31 degrees of difference between inside and outside, maintained by one cracked stove burning at moderate capacity and 4 limestone walls doing exactly what she had believed they would do, holding the heat the stove generated and releasing it slowly, the thermal mass of 2 feet of stone, evening out the extremes, the same way a root cellar evens out the difference between summer and winter. December announced itself with cold that had a different quality than November's cold, denser, more deliberate, the kind that settled into the landscape and gave no indication of reconsidering. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero on the 8th, 20 below on the 12th. The creek where she had cut cottonwood poles froze to the bottom, the sound of it changing overnight from the occasional crack of surface ice to the absolute silence of water that has stopped moving entirely. The prairie disappeared under 2 feet of accumulated snow, then 3. The fuel pile diminished in increments she tracked with the careful attention of someone who understands that each increment is a unit of time rather than a unit of material, and that the time was what she was actually spending. Agnes Cole arrived on the 15th of December, wrapped so thoroughly in layers that she was almost unrecognizable as a specific person carrying a bundle under her arm and pushing through the low doorway without ceremony. She set the bundle on the packed earth floor and said it was corn cobs, no good for cooking. She had more than she needed, but they burned. Eleanor started to object, and Agnes cut her off with the flat efficiency Eleanor had learned to expect from her. You can and you will. She looked around the shelter, then taking in the warm walls, the sleeping children bundled near the stove, the single lantern casting its orange light across the earthen ceiling. Her expression shifted through something that contained surprise and moved quickly through it to something that looked like having been wrong in a way that required acknowledgement. I'll be damned, Agnes said. It actually works. Eleanor told her so far. Agnes nodded at this, a single deliberate nod, the nod of someone filing information accurately. She mentioned that Waller was still predicting Eleanor would run out of fuel by February, that the math didn't resolve to survival past that point. Eleanor said Waller had been predicting her death since August, and Agnes said he was not usually wrong, and Eleanor said he was not always right either. They looked at each other across the corncob bundle in the warm light from the stove, and Agnes pulled her wrappings tighter and said something her husband had told her once in one of the intervals between bottles. When he'd been briefly accurate, mathematics couldn't account for stubbornness. She left without saying goodbye, which Eleanor had come to understand was Agnes's version of affection. The corncobs burned for 3 days. Christmas passed without ceremony one day, indistinguishable from the others, by virtue of being cold, requiring fuel, requiring food, requiring the same attention to the same systems that every day in December required. Eleanor marked it in her mind and let it pass. New Year's arrived and departed the same way. January came in with a held quality to the air, a breath that the weather was taking before something, though the something was not yet visible. By the second week of January, the fuel stockpile had declined past the threshold where Eleanor had been telling herself there was still enough. 3/4 of a cord had become half. Half had become a quarter. The cow chips burned faster than the wood, generating less heat per volume, requiring more frequent feeding. She was waking every 2 hours to stoke the stove, sleeping in the intervals, existing in the exhausted rhythm of someone for whom rest has become a maintenance function rather than a restoration. Caleb had stopped asking when things would get easier. Lily had started coming to Eleanor in the night, not from bad dreams, but simply to be close, pressing herself against her mother's side with the purposeful warmth of a small animal that understands exactly what warmth is for. On the 6th of January, the sky was clear and the temperature above freezing. Eleanor heard voices outside, mid-morning children from the direction of town, distant but audible, playing in the unusual mildness. She checked the thermometer at noon, 38 degrees, the highest reading in weeks. Caleb asked if the cold was breaking. She told him she didn't think so and didn't explain why, which was that the sky to the northwest had been developing a color since before noon that she had never seen before in her life, but that she recognized from the description Waller had given her months ago when he was still cataloging the ways she would die. Not the gray of ordinary cloud cover, but something with a yellow-green undercast, the color of a sky that has already decided what it intends to do and is simply traveling toward the moment of doing it. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind had started from the northwest, and by the time Eleanor got both children inside and stoked the stove and checked the timber brace she had added to the door the previous week, the snow had begun. Light at first, fine-grained, almost decorative. Within 2 hours, it was a wall of white moving horizontally, driven by a wind that had climbed from its earlier murmur to a register that was less a sound than a physical force pressing against the shelter's north wall, with the particular sustained violence of something that had been building its pressure for a long time and had finally found its direction. The temperature at nightfall was 15 below. At midnight, Eleanor read the thermometer Waller had nailed beside the door, 34 below zero. Inside the shelter, the stove burned at 3/4 capacity, which was the highest she could sustain given the remaining fuel, and the walls held the interior at 38 degrees. Cold enough to see the breath of 2 sleeping children as faint clouds in the lantern light. Not freezing. The distinction between those two conditions had become, in Eleanor's accounting, the central fact of existence. The storm did not pause on the 7th. It did not recede on the 8th. By the 9th, Eleanor had lost the ability to distinguish day from night, except by the slight shift in the quality of light coming through the single window, which the packed snow outside had reduced to a gray-white opacity that showed nothing beyond the glass. The wind had settled into a continuous roar, punctuated by deeper shrieks when it found the angles of the shelter and compressed itself through them, and Eleanor fed the stove and watched the fuel pile shrink and made the calculations she had been making daily now in shorter and shorter intervals, and arrived each time at the same answer, which was that she was not going to make it to April on what she had. On the morning of the 10th, the wind dropped, not gradually suddenly as if something had been cut. Eleanor was on her feet before she fully understood why the abrupt silence, after 4 days of sustained noise, carrying a quality that her nervous system read as warning before her mind caught up to explain it. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned and pushed the door open against the snow piled against it from outside. The world had been replaced. Where the prairie had been, there was only white sculpted by days of wind into shapes that had their own terrible beauty drifts, 15 feet high against the north wall ridges and valleys of packed snow extending in every direction. The path to Waller's property, invisible. The path to town, invisible. The fence lines, invisible. The entire known geography of the county, buried under a uniformity of white that was completely profoundly silent. The temperature read 41 below zero on the outdoor thermometer. Eleanor had never felt cold like this. It reached through her layers in the first 5 seconds and found the skin beneath them and told her in terms that were not ambiguous what it was capable of. She retreated inside and sealed the door. Caleb was awake, watching from his blankets near the stove, with the steady attention he brought to things that required steadiness. Is it over? The question carried no particular hope, only the pragmatic need for accurate information. Eleanor looked at the fuel pile, a quarter cord of wood, 2 days of cow chips, a dwindling stack of twisted hay. The honest answer was not yet. She gave him the honest answer. The knock came at noon, not when wind had been shaking the door for days and she knew its rhythm, the irregular pressure of something large and indifferent. This was rhythmic, deliberate. She took the axe from beside the stove, not from fear exactly, but from the understanding that anything able to reach her door through 15-foot drifts in 41 below cold was either very determined or very desperate, and both of those things warranted preparation. She opened the door. Henry Waller stood on the threshold, coated in ice from his collar to his boots, his face a mask of frost and something beneath the frost that as she identified before she could name it, the particular blankness of a person who has already absorbed what happened and is now operating on the other side of it. Behind him, barely visible through the white, were two shapes small enough to be children, which they were. Maynard 6 years old, Greta 4, both of them shaking with the deep involuntary shaking of cold that has gone past the muscles' ability to manage it usefully. Ice in their eyelashes. Lips the particular color that blue goes when it means something serious. The roof went, Waller said, his voice barely above a whisper, the sound of a man whose throat has been dealing with 40 below air for however long it took to cross 300 yards of 15-foot drifts. An hour ago, the snow weight I couldn't. He swayed slightly on his feet, caught himself. The children moved past him through the doorway without being told, drawn to the heat of the stove with the unthinking directness of animals. Eleanor pulled him inside. She asked because she needed to ask, even already knowing, "Where is Martha?" Waller did not answer immediately. He was looking at the sod ceiling above him, at the charred timber beams visible between the packed earth blocks. He was standing inside a shelter that should not have worked, built by a woman he had told would be dead by February, and it was standing while his own home, built with 10 years of experience and proper materials, and every technique the county had taught him, was a pile of collapsed sod and frozen debris 300 yards away. When he finally spoke, his voice had been flattened to something near monotone by a grief too large to shape into anything more specific. She stayed with the cattle. She thought she could save them. A pause that contained everything. I couldn't carry 3 people. I had to choose. Eleanor did not respond to this directly because there was nothing to say to it that would not make it worse. She moved to the children first. She stripped their outer layers, wrapped them in her own blankets, positioned them close to the stove. Caleb moved without being asked, giving up his place near the heat. Lily pressed herself against little Greta with the instinctive efficiency of a child who understands that body warmth is a resource that can be shared, and Greta, 4 years old and shaking, accepted this with the helpless gratitude of someone past the point of social formalities. Waller told her how he had found the shelter. He had pushed through the drifts in the direction he believed was correct, losing certainty within the first 100 yards when the storm closed the distance behind him and the landscape became identical in every direction. He had seen the smoke first. The stovepipe above the sod roof had been clear. When he looked up, the only dark vertical line in the entire white world, a column of smoke rising straight up into the still air between gusts. He had walked toward it. "I didn't know if you'd still be alive," he told her, the ice still melting from his hair, his hands thrust toward the stove. "I just walked toward the smoke." Eleanor gave Peter and Greta corn mush from what remained in the pot, hot enough that they burned their tongues on it and did not slow down for the burning. She gave Waller a cup of the same. 8 people were now in 320 square feet of stone and sod and charred timber and improvised everything, and the fuel pile that had been calculated for 3 would not recalculate evenly into 8 without shortening the result considerably. She ran the numbers while Waller thawed and the children slept in a tangled pile near the stove. Caleb and Peter Lily and Greta, 4 children, who had arrived at this particular place from different directions and were now arranged together with the unself-conscious practicality of shared survival. The burn rate at 8 people required the stove to run at a higher capacity to maintain any margin above freezing, which meant the fuel consumed per hour increased even as the human heat generated increased. 8 bodies produced warmth. She had read something once about the thermal output of a human body several hundred units per hour, and 8 of them in a closed stone shelter was a number that added something to the calculation. But it did not add enough, not to close the gap she was already carrying. The storm resumed that afternoon, wind building from the northwest again, the brief stillness of the morning collapsing back into the roar that had become the backdrop of all thought and action. Outside at 40 below, Martha Waller was somewhere in the rubble of her collapsed home or somewhere on the ground between the house and the barn, and no one in the shelter spoke this truth because speaking it did not change it, and the children were present, and Waller's face already carried the knowledge in a way that made external confirmation redundant. In the middle of the second night of the expanded shelter population, Waller spoke into the darkness where Eleanor was twisting hay into fuel sticks, her hands working by feel, now the motion automatic. "How did you know the walls would hold the heat?" His voice was low, careful, the voice of someone asking something they actually want answered, rather than asking something they want permission to dismiss. Eleanor's hands kept moving. She told him she hadn't known. She had a theory built from a root cellar in Pennsylvania, in a wall that was cool in August, and the logic of what stone does with temperature when you give it enough thickness. She had no engineering knowledge, no architectural training, no one who had told her the thing she was attempting was possible. She had guessed, and then built the guess, and then been fortunate. Waller said that was not the word for it, not fortune, not luck. He had built with 10 years of experience behind him, and his home had failed in 4 days. She had built from a theory in 8 weeks, and it was standing. "You saw something the rest of us missed," he said. Eleanor set down the haystick and began another. "I saw what I needed to see," she told him. "When you need something badly enough, you look at the world differently. I needed a solution that started from what I already had, not from what I was supposed to have." She paused. "I wasn't smarter than you, Mr. Waller. I was more desperate than you. Those aren't the same thing, but in this case, they led to the same place." Waller was quiet for a long time after that. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, carrying something lower and more fractured. "Martha told me to help you in August. She said you were going to die unless someone helped." Another pause that was doing significant structural work. "I said she'd die either way. I said there was no point wasting effort on a lost cause." The sound he made then was not quite crying, not quite anything that had a clean name, the sound of a man confronting the specific weight of a choice he made in a different world before the blizzard had reorganized what mattered and what didn't. Eleanor kept twisting hay. She did not tell him he couldn't have known, because he would not have believed it, and it would not have helped. She did not tell him Martha's choice was her own because he already knew and it had not reduced the weight. She told him what was true and small, and the only thing she had, we're alive and your children are alive and the fire is burning. She set the finished stick on the pile and started another. Stay with what's true right now. On the 11th, the temperature outside reached 46 below zero. Waller checked the outdoor thermometer at 2-hour intervals and reported the numbers in the flat voice of a man performing a function because the function needed performing, not because the numbers were telling him anything he wanted to hear. Inside the shelter, 35 degrees. The children had stopped shivering and had achieved the deep unconscious sleep of bodies that have expended everything they contained on the work of staying warm and have now surrendered to what the shelter and the fire and the shared warmth of 4 small bodies pressed together were providing. Agnes Cole's house caught fire on the evening of the 12th. Eleanor would learn the full account later. The chimney packed with ice from days of storm. The flue blocked the smoke, and then the heat backing down into the house, the fire taking the ceiling first, and then the walls with the speed that dry wood achieves when it has been curing in Kansas air for years. Agnes had perhaps 10 minutes from the first smell of something wrong to the moment the ceiling above the main room opened. She took that 10 minutes and used them efficiently, which was consistent with everything Eleanor knew of her: coat, gloves, shawl, and nothing else, because nothing else was retrievable in 10 minutes from a house whose ceiling was becoming its floor. 400 yards separated Agnes Cole's property from Eleanor's shelter, a distance that in ordinary conditions was a short walk. In 40 below air, with the wind resumed and the drifts reformed to 15 feet, in the intervening ground it was a distance measured in the minutes remaining before the extremities began to make decisions the rest of the body couldn't reverse. Agnes had one navigational asset: the stovepipe smoke from Eleanor's shelter, the same thin dark column that had guided Waller 2 days earlier, rising above the level of the drifts into the space where the storm's violence was slightly less complete. She walked toward it. She could not run. The snow was too deep, the drifts too varied, each step potentially the step that went to the hip, in a pocket the surface gave no warning about. She walked and she kept walking, and 400 yards took 22 minutes. And when Eleanor opened the door, Agnes Cole fell across the threshold rather than stepping through it. Her face had the particular white of frostbite establishing itself. Her lips were cracked and bleeding at both corners. Ice had formed in her hair and along the outer edge of both ears and in the fabric of the shawl where the moisture of her breath had frozen as it reached the air. Eleanor pulled her inside, and Waller was already moving, stripping the outer layer, applying the warmth of his own blanket, without being asked, because he had children of his own, and he understood what the aftermath of exposure required. Agnes spoke in fragments, interrupted by the shaking her body had resumed now that it had arrived somewhere warm enough for the shaking to serve its function: the chimney, the ceiling, the fire. The house was gone. She had watched it burn from 50 yards out, a house on fire in a blizzard at 40 below, which she characterized in the way Agnes characterized most things, as the most specific form of absurdity she had yet encountered in a life not short on the absurd. Then her eyes found Eleanor's. You were right. That ridiculous roof, the shade in the stone. She laughed, a rough sound that was also something else under the roughness, something that had been adjusting its position since August and had finally arrived where it was going. You were completely right. Eleanor pressed a cup of hot water into Agnes's shaking hands. Just water rationing had gone past the point where hot water came without accounting. Drink this slowly. 8 people, 320 square feet. The fuel calculation shifted for the second time in 4 days. Eleanor sat with the revised numbers in the darkness and the sound of the wind pressing against stone that had been pressed against by every storm in its history and had held every time, and she counted what remained: half a cord of wood, 1 basket of cow chips, 47 twisted hay sticks, 2 days at the current burn rate, maybe 3 with extreme reduction. The temperature inside at extreme reduction would drop to 28 degrees, which was 1 degree below freezing, which was survivable for healthy adults, and a different question for children. She was 1 day short of what she needed, and possibly two, and the storm that had been running for 6 days showed no indication that it had reached its conclusion. Agnes recovered enough to sit upright and think in consecutive sentences. Listen to Eleanor lay out the numbers with the frank arithmetic Eleanor had used since August. No decoration, no softening, just the figures and what they meant. Waller sat on the other side of the shelter with the same stillness. The children were asleep. 47 haysticks, half a cord, one basket, 2 days, maybe three, and however many days remained after that before the storm released the county back to ordinary cold, which was still cold, but not this cold, not this relentlessly and specifically lethal. "What is there that could burn?" Agnes asked, "that we haven't burned yet?" Eleanor looked around the shelter, the way she had been looking at it for 6 days, inventorying, calculating, looking for what she had not yet converted from its current use to fuel. The stove itself was iron and couldn't burn. The sod on the roof was frozen and wouldn't burn without drying. The limestone walls were limestone. There was nothing in the shelter that was wood except the makeshift door, the ladder propped against the south wall, and the lumber scraps she had stacked against the corner last October when she ran out of immediate use for them and couldn't make herself throw away anything that might eventually matter. It was Lily who named it first. She had been asleep, or Eleanor had believed she was asleep, which was different. She was 5 years old, and she had been in this shelter through 6 days of blizzard, and she had been listening with the whole body attention she brought to everything, and she sat up from her place beside Greta and looked at her mother with dark, calm eyes and said what she had assembled from some combination of the present inventory problem and a story Eleanor had told months ago in Pennsylvania in a different world about a neighbor of her grandmother's who had survived a coal shortage one winter by burning the furniture piece by piece until spring. "Mama, the ladder. Can we burn the ladder?" The silence that followed was not the silence of people who had not considered this. It was the silence of people who had been facing the problem from the direction of what they had rather than from the direction of what they no longer needed, and a 5-year-old had just turned the calculation 180 degrees and made the answer visible. Eleanor looked at the ladder. 12 rungs, good dry wood. She looked at the door frame, fitted tight, built too well but burnable. She looked at the lumber scraps in the corner. She ran the numbers quickly and then more carefully and arrived at the same answer both times, another 36 hours, possibly 40. Added to what remained of the existing fuel, it was enough to reach the edge of what the storm could reasonably sustain. If the storm was reasonable, if the weather that had been demonstrating for 6 days that it had no interest in the positions of individual human beings on the Kansas prairie was willing to conclude on a schedule that aligned with what 36 additional hours bought. Waller's voice came from across the shelter, quiet and stripped of the certainty he had arrived in the county with. "It still leaves us short." "Less short," Eleanor said and picked up the axe. The ladder came apart in 12 minutes. She worked alongside Waller, who held the pieces while she worked the axe into the gaps, and the wood was dry, and it would burn clean, and it would burn long. And the 36 hours it added to the calculation was not certainty and was not safety, but it was the difference between the storm needing to end tonight and the storm being allowed to end tomorrow, or the day after without taking everyone in this shelter with it when it finally released. She set the first ladder rung into the stove and watched it catch. 36 hours. The door frame next if it came to that. The lumber scraps after. And after all of that, if the storm was still running, something else, because there was always something else, there had always been something else. The whole of the last 6 months had been the discovery that something else existed around every corner of apparent impossibility if she was willing to turn the corner and look. The fire took the new wood and straightened and burned brighter than it had in days, and the walls absorbed it. The door frame burned through the night of the 13th and into the pre-dawn hours of the 14th, the wood releasing its heat in the steady, patient way of something that has been curing in dry air for months and has finally found its purpose. Eleanor fed the stove in pieces, rationing the frame the same way she had rationed everything, not by how much she wanted to give it, but by how long she needed it to last, which was a calculation that required her to hold the end date in mind, even when the end date was not visible from where she was standing. Waller took the first watch after midnight, and she slept for 3 hours in the particular way she had been sleeping for a week, not deeply but completely, the way an animal sleeps when it has accepted that the environment requires alertness, but the body requires maintenance regardless. She woke to his voice low and even, not directed at her, but filling the space between them, the way certain kinds of honesty fill a room not loudly, but completely, leaving no corner untouched. He was sitting on the far side of the stove, with his hands open in his lap, looking at the mica window and the fire behind it, and he had been talking for some time before Eleanor was awake enough to catch the words. "I've been asking myself since the roof went down what I built wrong," Waller said. His voice carried the flatness of someone who has been through the question many times and is reporting the conclusion rather than performing the arrival at it. "The answer I kept coming back to was the materials. Wrong materials for that load. The sod walls compacted wrong under the snow weight, and the whole structure became a lever against itself." He paused. "That's the engineering answer. I've been trying to figure out if there's a different one." Eleanor was awake but did not announce it. She lay still and let him continue because he was talking to the fire rather than to her, and some things needed the fire as their audience first. "You asked me in August what killed the families I'd seen die," he said. "I told you roofs fuel food stores. 3 things. And I believe that. I still believe it. But I've been lying in this shelter for 8 days watching you run this thing, and I think I missed something." The fire cracked inside the stove. "The families who died I prepared for the same winters they faced. Same cold, same duration, same requirements. I survived because I built correctly and stored correctly, and I knew what I was doing." He looked at his hands. "What I didn't build for was the thing I didn't expect. The extra days, the extra weight, the variable that doesn't appear in any calculation because it hasn't happened yet." Eleanor sat up. He registered the movement but didn't stop. "Your walls hold because stone doesn't have a breaking point that changes with accumulated load the way sod does. You chose a material because of what it did with temperature, and it turned out to also be the material that handles sustained structural pressure better than anything else in the county." He finally looked at her across the dim, warm space between them. "You weren't building for the storm we expected. You were building for a storm you couldn't have predicted, and the material you chose happened to be the right one for both." Eleanor considered this for a moment in the way she considered things that were accurate but incomplete. "I wasn't thinking about storm loads," she told him. "I was thinking about heat. The decision that made these walls was about temperature, not structure." She pulled her blanket around her shoulders. "I got lucky in a direction I wasn't aiming. You got lucky because you started from what was true instead of from what was usual." His voice changed then, moving from the analytical register into something lower and less managed. Martha would have understood that. She thought in that direction from what was actually there rather than from what was supposed to be there. The fire in the stove had settled to a steady burn, the door frame's last sections giving their heat without drama. "She told me you were going to solve it. In August, before you'd built a single thing, she looked at you standing in that ruin, and she told me you were going to solve it." Eleanor did not say the kind things that presented themselves for saying, because Waller was not asking for kindness. He was making an accounting, the kind a man makes when the ledger of a decision can no longer be revised but must simply be read accurately for the first time. She gave him what she had, which was the truth as she understood it. "You couldn't have carried 3 people through that storm." "I know." His voice broke on the word, not dramatically but structurally, the way a beam breaks a sound and then a different configuration than before. "I know the mathematics of it. I've done the mathematics of it every hour for the past 8 days, and they come out the same every time. I could not have carried Martha and both children through 40 feet of 15-foot drifts at 40 below zero. It was not physically possible. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The mathematics don't care that I knew that, and chose the children and walked away from her while she was still alive. The shelter held its warmth around them both. The children breathed in their sleep, all four of them, the sound of it, an involuntary and continuous proof of something. Eleanor sat with what Waller had said and did not try to resolve it because it did not resolve. It was a thing that would remain exactly what it was for the rest of his life, accurate and unbearable. Simultaneously, the two conditions coexisting without canceling each other. "Your children are alive," she said finally. Not as comfort, but as fact offered the way she offered all facts, because it was true, because it was all she had, because truth was the only currency she had ever found that didn't depreciate under pressure. Waller lowered his hands. He looked at his son and daughter asleep in the pile of children near the stove, Peter's arm thrown across Caleb's shoulder. Greta's face turned toward Lily's warmth. He looked at them for a long time without speaking, and Eleanor let him look, because looking was what he needed, and she had nothing better to offer than the space in which to do it. The ladder was ash. The door frame was ash. The lumber scraps were half gone. Eleanor twisted the remaining hay into fuel sticks, while the others slept working through the fourth hour past midnight, with hands that had lost their feeling at the fingertips 2 days ago and had not recovered it since. She had wrapped them in strips of the canvas that had covered the cow chips outside, which was not elegant, but kept the skin attached while she worked. 47 sticks on the pile when she started. 63, now the additional 16, the result of 3 hours of sustained effort by hands that were reporting their objections in terms she had learned to register and continue past. On the morning of the 14th, she counted what remained. The number she arrived at was not the number she needed, but it was closer to it than it had been the night before, which was the only direction that mattered. She shared the count with Waller and Agnes in the level tone she had used for all such accountings, not falsely bright, not catastrophizing, just accurate. Agnes received it with a single nod. Waller received it with the stillness of a man who has been making his own parallel calculations and had arrived at the same answer. 1 day short, Agnes said. Maybe 2. The lumber scraps will buy another 12 hours after the haystacks run out, Eleanor told them. After that, we look at what else is in here that burns. Agnes looked around the shelter with the appraising eyes she brought to everything ceiling, to floor corner to corner, the systematic inventory of a woman who has been running a property alone long enough to know that every object has multiple potential uses, and the one it was built for is not always the most urgent one. Her gaze stopped on the stacked planks that served as the sleeping platform she and Eleanor had constructed for the children to get them off the cold earth. The sleeping platform, Agnes said, not a question. Eleanor had already thought of it and had not said it aloud yet, because saying it meant the children would sleep on the packed earth floor, which was survivable but colder, and not something she wanted to impose unless the alternative was worse. The alternative was now demonstrably worse. She started disassembling the sleeping platform that afternoon, with Waller's help, working the joints apart carefully to preserve the longest possible burn lengths, stacking the planks beside the remaining lumber scraps, with the methodical precision of people managing the last inventory of something that matters. Caleb watched this without comment, then wordlessly moved his blanket to the ground and arranged it, carefully redistributing the padding to account for the lost elevation. Lily watched her brother, then moved her own arrangement to match. Greta and Peter followed the 4 children, reorganizing themselves on the earth floor with a practical cooperation that required no discussion, because they had been watching their parents and the adults in this shelter make adaptations for 9 days and had learned the grammar of it. Agnes touched Eleanor's arm briefly, a contact that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, which for Agnes was an extended display of affection. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The 16th hour after Eleanor's count was the hour the sleeping platform ran out. The 17th was the hour that should have been the last, the hour past which the calculation said they had nothing left to burn. Eleanor was awake for all of it, feeding the stove with the final pieces of dry wood and then the remaining hay sticks in pairs rather than singly to keep the fire above the threshold that mattered the temperature, in the shelter hovering at 30 degrees and declining slowly toward the number that was the line between difficult and impossible. She was not praying exactly. She was not a woman who had much experience with prayer. She was doing something that resembled it only in its direction, a sustained and concentrated attention, aimed at nothing she could name, but that the walls seemed to receive regardless the stone warm under her hand, steady, unhurried, releasing what it had stored. The wind died at 3 in the morning on the 15th of January, 1887. Not gradually, as completely and suddenly as it had started 9 days earlier, as if a mechanism had been running and had simply reached its stop. Eleanor felt the change before she heard it, a shift in the pressure against the north wall, the sustained force that had been the constant background condition of the past 9 days lifting all at once. Then the sound or the absence of it. True silence, absolute and startling, the kind that the ear interprets as wrong, because it has recalibrated over days to understand noise as the normal condition of the world. She was on her feet before the silence had lasted 5 seconds. She crossed to the planks covering the doorway and pulled them aside. The cold that entered was immediate and thorough, 22 below zero, which she felt in her lungs before she read it on the thermometer, the temperature carrying the particular clean bite of cold air from which the wind has been removed. But the sky above the eastern wall of the shelter was dark blue, going lighter at the very edge of the horizon, a specific shade she had not seen since the 5th of January, and it was covered edge to edge with stars burning so clearly in the still air that she could see the gradations between them, the dense center of the sky and the sparser edges, the whole thing steady and fixed and not moving. The storm had stopped. She stood in the opening and breathed the still air and did not feel relief exactly, or not only relief, what she felt was more complicated and less nameable, the arrival at a threshold she had been moving toward for so long that the arrival itself required a moment to process. She had told Caleb on the morning of the 10th that the storm stopping was not the same as it being over. She stood in the doorway of the shelter she had built from $5 in theory and borrowed equipment in an 8-year-old's arms on a rope and a 71-year-old's shoulders on a ladder, and the storm had stopped. And she breathed the still air until her eyes watered from the cold, and the water froze on her cheekbones before she could wipe it, and then she went back inside. Waller was awake, watching from across the room. She didn't say anything. He looked at her face and at the change in the quality of the silence and said, "God in heaven," in the voice of someone receiving information they had been waiting for long enough to have doubted they would receive it. They woke the children carefully, which was unnecessary because children in that shelter had not been sleeping deeply enough to require careful waking. They surfaced quickly, the way animals surface when the quality of the air changes. Caleb sat up first, fully alert in the same instant, and looked at his mother's face and read whatever was written there. Lily sat up behind him. Peter and Greta followed, blinking. Eleanor pushed the plank barrier aside, and 8 people stepped out of the shelter into the still cold of a Kansas morning that was 22 below zero and completely perfectly motionless. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern horizon, but the sky above it was the color that comes before sunrise, that specific progression from dark blue through pale blue to the thin orange line where the atmosphere met the earth. The drifts were enormous, sculpted by 9 days of sustained wind into shapes that looked architectural, 15 feet against the north wall ridges, running in parallel lines across the open ground to the southwest, the hollows between them deep and shadow-filled in the pre-dawn light. The entire geography of the county had been reorganized. Every path, every fence line, every familiar landmark swallowed or reshaped into something that had to be navigated newly without the assistance of memory. Where Waller's homestead had stood 300 yards north, there was a depression in the snow, just that, the shape of something that had been there and was no longer there, outlined in white. The children stood in the doorway with their faces turned toward the pale eastern sky, their breath rising in small white clouds that dispersed in the still air without any wind to carry them. Lily took Greta's hand without looking at her. Caleb stepped out first, breaking through the crust of the drift nearest the door with one foot and pulling it back and trying a different angle, testing the surface the same way Eleanor had taught him to test the ice of the creek in the weeks before the storm, when they had been cutting firewood, systematic, careful learning the load before committing weight to it. Agnes stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame where the frame had been and looked at the black mark on the horizon 200 yards west where her house had stood before the chimney fire. The stone chimney still rose from the snow, alone, the house around it gone to ash and ice. She looked at it for a long time without moving, and her face did something complicated that Eleanor watched from the side without interpreting, because it was not her face to interpret. When Agnes finally moved, it was to step fully out of the shelter and into the cold, and her posture as she did it was the posture of someone deciding something rather than accepting something, which was a distinction Eleanor had come to understand mattered. Waller walked out past the first drift line and stopped and stood with his back to the shelter looking north. He was looking toward where his house had been, toward the depression in the snow that was the only visible record of 11 years of work. He stood there for a full minute without moving, and no one spoke, and the silence of the post-storm prairie was so complete that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat with an unusual clarity, the sound of it carrying something it had not carried when the wind was making the walls flex. He turned back. His face had the particular expression of a man who has looked directly at the worst thing and found that he is still standing. "It's stopped," he said. "It's stood," Eleanor agreed. "That's not the same as it being over." He looked at her and she saw in his face that he understood what she meant. Not the cold which would continue for weeks, not the drifts which would take months to disappear, but the work. The actual work of what came after the rebuilding and the accounting and the living forward into the season that had just demonstrated exactly what it was capable of. "No," he said, "it's not." The county emerged from the snow over the following days in the way that things emerge from catastrophe, slowly, incompletely, with gaps that clarified as the scale of the damage became legible. 19 people had died in the 9 days of the blizzard, 13 from cold exposure in structures that had failed or exposure taken willingly to perform some task that the cold made fatal. 4 from buildings whose roofs had collapsed under the snow, weight bringing walls and contents down together. 2 from a fire that had started when a stove was overloaded in an attempt to generate enough heat from a shelter that could not retain it, the fire spreading to the dry timber frame before it could be controlled. Of the 23 families in and around Russell, 17 had survived in their own homes. 3 had sheltered with neighbors whose homes were sturdier than their own. 3 had survived by reaching Eleanor's shelter, Waller, and his 2 children on the 10th, Agnes on the 12th. Martha Waller's body was found on the 17th of January, 2 days after the storm broke, when Waller and 2 men from town dug through the collapsed debris of the Saudi in the specific location where the barn had stood and where the path between the house and the barn had run. She had made it to within 20 yards of the barn door. Whether she reached it and turned back or never reached it at all was not determinable, and Waller did not ask about this from the men who found her, and they did not volunteer the information. He stood at the grave 3 days later in ground that required 2 hours of digging with a full work party to open the earth frozen to a depth that pickaxes addressed 1 inch at a time. Peter stood on his left, Greta on his right, her small hand wrapped inside his. Eleanor stood slightly behind and to the side, not because she had been assigned that position, but because it was the right distance, close enough to be present far enough to give him the space that grief requires when it is being conducted in public. The funeral was not long. The minister said the things ministers said, and the county said amen, and the frozen ground received what it was given. Waller did not cry at the graveside, which Eleanor did not interpret as the absence of grief, but as its management, the particular containment that people employ when they are in the presence of their children. and understand that their children's stability in this moment requires theirs. He had cried in the shelter in the dark with no audience but the fire and Eleanor's steady presence on the other side of the room. He had spent what needed spending there, which was perhaps the more important accounting. Waller came on the 20th of January, 5 days after the storm broke, carrying firewood he had scavenged from what the storm had left accessible and would not say from where. He set it at the door of the shelter and asked if Eleanor would teach him to build the way she had built. He asked it without preamble, without the careful positioning she might have expected from a man of his pride, directly the way he had always communicated, stripped of the certainty that had previously accompanied everything he said, but retaining the essential quality of sincerity that she had recognized in him from August, even when his certainty had been aimed at predicting her death. She told him yes. She told him the first thing he needed to understand was that he was not learning a new method. He was learning a combination of things that already existed, and the combination was something anyone could have assembled who started from the right question. He asked what the right question was. She told him it was not, how do I build correctly, but what does the material I already have actually do? Because the fence post limestone was everywhere in this county, running in seams just below the surface of the prairie, soft enough when freshly quarried to cut with hand tools, and hardening to near permanent durability after a season of exposure to air. She had not invented limestone. She had noticed what it did with temperature when she was too tired and too afraid to look at anything except what was directly in front of her. She told him this not as modesty, but as precision, because she had been precise about everything else, and there was no reason to be imprecise about this. 19 dead. 3 families with nothing left. No shelter, no stored food, no livestock, nothing to return to. Agnes fell into this category, and Waller fell into this category, and a family named Kohler, 3 miles northwest, fell into it too. The parents and their 2 children having died together in the collapsed structure, which meant the category did not require the living to navigate it. Agnes and Waller did, and they navigated it differently, which was consistent with their characters in all other respects. Waller rebuilt in March once the ground had thawed enough to quarry stone. He built with the focused competence of a man who had spent 11 years learning construction and was now applying that knowledge to a fundamentally different material, and the result was a structure that was technically superior to Eleanor's shelter in every way that could be measured. Better fitted joints, more precise roof pitch, properly mortared window frames. Agnes helped with the heavy work and asked questions throughout, and Eleanor answered the questions that had technical answers and sent Agnes to Waller for the ones that required construction knowledge she didn't have. Agnes rebuilt in April on the same site as her burned house, and she built differently from both Waller and Eleanor because she was Agnes Cole, and building differently from everyone was her primary mode of operation. She found limestone deposits on her own property that no one had quarried closer to the surface than the county average, and she cut and stacked them over 3 weeks with the systematic efficiency that had characterized everything she had done since Thomas Cole stopped being useful. She asked Eleanor for help with the sod roof on a Sunday morning in early April, arriving with a wagon loaded with cut sod blocks in a look that contained nothing of the woman who had stood in Eleanor's field last August, asking sharp questions about the weight of 3 tons and the structural reliability of charred timber. "I was wrong about you," Agnes said, standing in Eleanor's doorway with the April sun behind her, making no more ceremony of it than she made of anything. "In August, I thought you were determined, but not practical. I was wrong about the practical part." Eleanor told her to bring the sod inside the fence before the wind came up, and Agnes laughed a real laugh, rough and short, and completely genuine, the laugh of a woman who had just been given exactly the response she deserved and recognized it. By the time April's building season was underway, word of the shelter and what it had held through the blizzard had spread to settlements 20 miles in every direction. Families came to examine the construction, to ask questions, to stand inside the walls, and feel the particular quality of warmth that stone and sod in combination produced. Eleanor answered everything asked of her in the same plain language she used for all explanations, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick when words were insufficient, walking people through the quarrying process for the fence post limestone that ran just below the surface across the county. She charged nothing for any of it. On a warm afternoon in May, Agnes sat beside Eleanor on the low stone bench against the shelter's south wall, the first green of summer beginning to show in the sod seams overhead. She told Eleanor directly that she was failing to capitalize on what she had accomplished, patent the design, charge a fee, license the method to builders in neighboring counties. Eleanor could be prosperous rather than merely surviving, Agnes said, and she delivered this the way she delivered everything, as practical assessment rather than reproach. Eleanor looked at the June grass beginning in the seams she had packed with soil 9 months ago. You built a shelter that kept 8 people alive through the worst blizzard in 20 years of Kansas records, Agnes pressed, and you did it with $5 in 8 weeks and no prior construction experience, and you call that nothing worth protecting. I call it being desperate enough to pay attention, Eleanor said. That's a different thing from being brilliant, and it's available to anyone. She pressed her palm against the warm limestone beside her. The stone was here before I arrived. The principle was here before I arrived. Making someone pay for what the land already offers seemed like exactly the wrong lesson to take from all of this. Agnes made the sound she made when she was filing something in the category of things she would revisit rather than things she had resolved. She did not press further, which from Agnes was its own form of acknowledgement. The mason in Victoria had begun offering to build what his advertisement called marsh-style construction for anyone with the materials and the fee. Eleanor saw the advertisement because Caleb read it to her from a newspaper left at the land office, and she sat with the fact of her name on a paid advertisement for a thing she had built out of necessity and given away freely, and what she felt was mild surprise and then a return to the beans she had been sorting when Caleb started reading. Clarence Dodd returned in June, arriving from Topeka in the same polished buggy, with the same clean suit and the same boots, looking exactly as he had looked the previous August, except for something behind his eyes that was different in a way Eleanor noted before she could name it. He stopped at the edge of her garden and looked at the shelter for a winged time longer than August, longer than the calculation required, the look of a man reading something rather than appraising it. He climbed down and told her he had come to make an offer. She told him before he named it that the shelter was not for sale, the property was not for sale, the methods were not for sale. He said he had not come to buy anything. I was wrong about you specifically, he said, and the words arrived with the careful precision of someone who has been practicing the sentence and still finds the delivery difficult. I've been in this business 15 years, and I purchased 23 properties from people I assessed correctly. I assessed you incorrectly. He paused. I want to understand what you built and why it worked, not to profit from the understanding, but because I am in the business of evaluating things, and I evaluated this one wrong, and I would like to know where my method failed. Eleanor looked at him for a moment that contained the full distance between August and June. Then she told him to take off his jacket if he was going to stand in the Kansas sun, and gestured to the bench. She sat across from him on the ground and explained thermal mass in the plainest language. She had the same explanation she had been giving since March, the same principle, the same limestone and sod, the same thing available to anyone willing to look at what the land already offered. Dodd came back twice more that year, once in the fall and once the following spring, both times with questions rather than offers. Eleanor answered the questions and sent him away with the information. The third visit she had expected never materialized, which she took as confirmation that he had learned what he needed to learn, which was, in her assessment of him, the best possible outcome from the original transaction. Waller remarried in 1891, a woman from Edwards County named Frances, who came with her own history of difficult seasons and her own views on construction quality, and who regarded Eleanor with the careful respect of someone who has heard a story many times and is still adjusting her understanding of it with each telling. He became, in the years after the blizzard, the most vocal advocate for limestone building in the county, traveling to neighboring settlements to talk about the storm, and what it had demonstrated, always beginning and ending with the same point, with the woman who had bought a roofless ruin for $5 and shown him that knowing how to do things correctly was not the same as knowing which things to do. He gave her full credit every time. She told him every time that the credit was imprecise, and he said every time that he didn't care that imprecise credit given to the right person was better than precise credit given to no one. Ruth Becker died in the fall of 1892 in the shelter she had lived in since her husband's death, surrounded by the practical and minimal evidence of a life conducted with great competence and very little ceremony. Eleanor walked the 2 miles east the morning after she heard, and she stood at the door of the shelter and looked at the limestone walls Ruth had built herself 20 years prior, and she understood for the first time fully what she had seen in Ruth's face the day Ruth handed her the strip of clean cloth. Ruth had been looking at her own hands in that moment, had been telling Eleanor something true about herself as much as offering practical advice. She had been a woman who had built things with her hands that lasted, and she had recognized in Eleanor someone who might do the same. Eleanor patched Ruth's barn roof that spring, as she had promised alone, on a morning in April, when the air had just enough warmth in it to be encouraging. She worked alone because it was her debt and not someone else's to discharge, and when she finished, she stood in the barn doorway and looked at the repaired roof for a moment, with the particular satisfaction of a promise kept to someone who would not see the keeping but had trusted it anyway. Agnes Cole died in the spring of 1903, suddenly between 1 week and the next, the way Agnes did everything without surplus preparation or lingering uncertainty. Eleanor attended the funeral in the same position she had attended Martha Waller's funeral, slightly behind and to the side the appropriate distance. The limestone shelter Agnes had built on her property would stand for another 30 years. The chimney of the burned frame house still rose from the ground nearby, the one Agnes had kept as what she called a monument to the difference between what looks like shelter and what actually is, which Eleanor always thought was the most Agnes thing Agnes had ever said. Caleb grew into a man who built things which was not something Eleanor had planned for him, but which appeared to have been planned for him by the 8 months of his childhood spent watching his mother build something from nothing. He was 15 when he helped a neighboring family build a limestone foundation, 18 when he built his first complete structure alone, 23 when he moved north to Barton County, where the limestone deposits ran particularly thick. He came back twice a year, spring and fall, and he always pressed his palm against the limestone of the shelter wall when he arrived, not consciously, she thought, just as a habitual acknowledgement of something, the way you touch the wall of a place you grew up in to confirm it is still what you remember. Lily stayed closer and then not close, and then close again, which is the pattern of daughters and mothers navigating the distance that independence requires and the proximity that affection produces. She was 12 when she began teaching the younger children of the county the underlying reasoning her mother had demonstrated to her, the habit of asking what a material actually does before deciding what to do with it. The practice of looking at what you have rather than cataloging what you lack. She was not teaching it as a formal method. She was teaching it as a way of thinking that had been shown to her by a specific woman solving a specific problem in which she had recognized as something more general than its particular demonstration. Eleanor lived in the shelter for 34 years after the blizzard, patching and maintaining it, but not substantially altering it, the limestone walls and sod roof remaining essentially what she had built in 8 weeks in the late summer and early fall of 1886. She never rebuilt it into a conventional house because it did not need to be a conventional house. It needed to be what it was, which was a shelter that worked, and it worked every winter for 3.5 decades without requiring her to become something she was not. The sod roof was replaced twice, once in 1901 when the original blocks had finally decayed past their useful life, and again in 1914 when a wet spring followed by a hard frost compromised the middle section. Both times she rebuilt it the same way, same pitch, same depth, same principle, because the principle was what she had built, and the principle remained correct. She was found on the 15th of March, 1921, in the chair her son had built for her 40th birthday, a straight-back thing made from cottonwood that Caleb had joined and fitted with the precision he had learned from watching her fit sod blocks into a roof that had to hold 3 tons without forgetting a single seam. She was facing the stove, which had burned down to coals. The shelter was warm. The limestone walls had absorbed the last of the fire's heat and were holding it in the specific and patient way that stone holds what it is given, slowly, completely releasing it back into the space across the hours with no drama, no acceleration, simply the steady return of what had been stored. The walls stood. They stand in the form they were built in 2 feet thick fence post limestone that Eleanor Marsh quarried from the prairie and laid herself in the late summer of 1886, blackened at the crown, where the Hendrick fire had burned through decades before she purchased them solid through their full depth. The sod roof is long gone as sod roofs go replaced and finally left to the sky when there was no one left to replace it. But the walls are the walls she built. They remain in the part of Russell County that used to be the edge of town and is now something else, the landscape reorganized by a century of change, the way the blizzard of 1887 reorganized it for a season completely and without consulting anyone who lived there. If you press your palm against the limestone in summer, it is cool. The same cool it has always been, the temperature of the night before stored in 2 feet of stone against the August heat. The principle unchanged, the material doing what it does without being asked and without stopping. Eleanor Marsh pressed her hand against that wall in the summer of 1886 and felt it and understood what it meant. And the understanding was not complicated and was not brilliant and was available to anyone who needed it badly enough to stand still and pay attention to what the material in front of them was actually doing. She had needed it badly enough. The limestone held everything she gave it and returned it faithfully. It does still.